I just want to say good evening to all of you and welcome you tonight to Green College to a speakers series to the Writer in Residence, Writer in Reticence speakers series, which I've been organizing here, one event each month. And our event tonight is, I call the whole series the Public and Resistant Form. I'm just trying to get people to pick arguments with each other, actually. But this one, last month we talked about poetry as resistant form. Tonight we're going to be talking about translation as resistant form. And I'm just, before I introduce our three speakers tonight, I'm going to just read their biographies. Or maybe I'll do the reverse, and that way you'll forget who they are and you'll think about instead what they might talk about. So on my far right, which is on your left, is Uljana Wolf, who lives in Berlin and Brooklyn, and I managed to snatch her while she was on this side of the Atlantic. She's one of the most acclaimed German poets of her generation, of the new generation, and she also translates poetry into German, as far as I know, probably from more languages, but from Polish and from American English, and she's a key person actively building the transatlantic communities of poetic influence and care, which are so important in our English-dominated poetry world. She's got 4 books of poetry with cookbooks in Berlin, and the most recent one, which I can't pronounce, Meine schönste Langeweile.
That was pretty good.
Okay.
It's half English anyway.
Yes. Sonne from Ort, a collaborative erasure of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets with the American poet Christian Hawkey. And among the poets that Wolf has translated into German or into German in Germany and into other places where German is spoken are John Ashbery, Charles Olson, Matea Harvey, Christian Hawkey, Erín Moure, some obscure Canadian poet, and Cole Swenson. And a new English translation by Sophie Seita of Uljana's work is forthcoming this spring from Wonder Press, Brooklyn, which I already had a chance to see, and it's a wonderful little book. And we're really happy that we've been able to bring Uljana out from the east into the fog for 24 hours. Speak with us. I'm going to introduce everybody and then read my proposal. Roman, just next to Roman Ivashkiv, has just finished his PhD, but you're not allowed to call him Dr. Ivashkiv yet because the ink's still wet.
I haven't framed it yet.
He's very modest. He wants to wait till April. At the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And his dissertation was called Transmis in Slavic Literary Postmodernism, Understanding Translation Through Fiction. He examines in that book, in that dissertation, soon to be a book, the theoretical and practical implications of the phenomenon of a transmesis, which is the mimesis or portrayal of translation in fiction, in Slavic postmodernist novels, both Russian and Ukrainian. And alongside translation studies and practice, his research interests include literary theory, comparative literature, and film. He has a whole pile of degrees, 2 of them a BA and MA in translation and interpretation from Ivan Franko University in Lviv, Ukraine, and a further MA in Russian and comparative literature from Penn State in the USA. And he recently co-translated with Erín Moure. You can tell who wrote this biography. Several poems by contemporary Ukrainian poet Yuri Izdrik, one of which was published in 2014 in the Malahat Review. Right beside me is Vancouver artist Alison Clay, who first made her mark and appeared on the scene and disrupted it in the 1980s in painting. And she's been working since to fool everybody by working in diverse media. And she has a strong interest in narrative and text-based performative works as well. Her concerns include identity, gender, and the boundaries between public and private space. And so I say that if any artist is a translator, it's Alison Clay. She's got a BFA from the Atlantic Ocean, from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and an MFA from Wreck Beach. And UBC. And she's exhibited nationally and internationally in the middle between those oceans and beside other oceans. Her artwork resides in several collections, including the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, the Banff Centre, and the Art Gallery of Windsor. And she's received several awards, residencies, and handouts in envelopes, And she teaches, deservedly so, however, she teaches in the School for Contemporary Arts at Simon Fraser University. So tonight we're going to be talking about translation as resistance form. The instructions that I gave to people were, the words that I put out were, literary works over time are footnoted and critiqued in new ways in order to implicate them in the contemporary moment, in order for a literary work to remain contemporary and to speak to us as a contemporary. Often after a few centuries, it needs footnotes. And translations, however, are often seen by the public as like copies or as inferior versions, but not as works. And that because they're seen as being reliant on the real original. And as such, they rarely persist in time and receive the same amount of footnoting and criticism. And so that works in translation, when the age and when the contemporary moment moves on, get retranslated to respond to the contemporary, to demands for accuracy or readability or things like that. And when new translations arise, like those recently as they've moved into the public domain of Kafka and Dostoevsky, or new translations of Cervantes or Beowulf, they cause a stir. And so I ask, is it time that deforms translation and alters its reception, or is it the subjectivity of the translator and the reader play a role? Does translation tell us something about the structure of language and thinking that goes against the grain of what we think we know? Is translation a resistant form? What is its relationship to the public? What can visual art practice and its translations between ideas and images teach us about translation as a whole? So we have our three people gathered today. I'm going to turn it over to them in the order that I just introduced them. And before I do, I just want to remark again that in this little corner of the Vancouver landscape, we're on lands that were traditionally and historically lands used by the Musqueam people and unceded as of yet. But we are allowed to be here. And I wanted to draw your attention again to one of the places, because they have a fabulous site, the Musqueam people, of Kaiwum, the rock that was near this place, which was one of the special sites in their culture that translates something like howling dog rock. So like, let's rock and howl. So everybody will talk for plus or minus 10 minutes, and then we'll have time to berate them with questions.
Okay, so I thank you, Erin, so much for inviting me. And
you have to hold that near your face.
Yeah. Microphone is better. Okay.
Yeah, it's better for the.
Hello. So I resisted thinking about all the things that resist translation. Something that I come up as a translator all the time. That I have texts that totally seem to be intranslatable or resist. And I really try to think about what is in translation that is resisting, or what could it resist. And I thought about this a little bit on broad terms in conjecture and conjunction, thank you, with something else that I'm thinking about, which is monolingualism, or more precisely how nation and identity and language get often really knotted together. And I prepared this little talk, and it's 10, 12 minutes, so I'm just going to read it. The title is Mother Tongues, which is a conflation of the German word Muttersprache, mother language, and mother tongue, and English muttering. Mother tongues on translation, nation, and memory. And they have, I have two epigraphs, one by a Canadian, Claude Vivier. I shaped my origins exactly as I wished. And the second is by Don Mi Choi, a Korean-American translator. I speak rubbish and you hear it as English. I scribble like a foreigner. Translations are alternative memory. They are memography. They are mainly so in the Benjaminian sense that they issue not from the life, but from the afterlife of the original. Quote, their translations mark their stage of continued life. Translations remember the original, but differently than it could ever remember itself. And in doing so, they graph it, write it, reimagine it. Yet translation as memography also means a rewriting, literally, as typo and tripping, of the complex relationships between mother tongue and other tongue, domestic and foreign, kinship and strangers, belonging and longing. Translations as other memographies can detect scattered deposits, deformations, nomadic masses moved across and through texts, bodies, and histories. An example, my first book, Kochanie, ich habe Brot gekauft, deals with German-Polish history, suppressed memories and male narratives, dislocation and silence. Some of the poems are set in a post-perestroika industrial region of Silesia, with its smokestacks, train tracks, and mining history, which was the history of German settlement in the Polish region hundreds of years ago. A translator, or was it only a reader, found these landscapes to be reminiscent of the Holocaust. He translated not the author's intent, but an alternative memory that was embedded in the poems and their inherent tensions and conflicting national narratives. My fathers are simple surveyors. The first one cries, the second is silent, the third one charts what the maps conceal. What interests me is this. The birth of what we consider a modern translation theory during German Romanticism took place alongside a philosophical shift that fundamentally and fatally linked together mother tongue, identity, and the nation-state. It was the birth of what Jasmin Yildiz calls the monolingual paradigm, where the Muttersprache, the mother tongue, stands for a, quote, unique, irreplaceable, unchangeable biological origin that situates the individual automatically in a kinship network and by extension in the nation. As Yildiz shows with Kittler and others, this origin for which the Muttersprache stands is itself a construction of male authority and a narrative that corresponds with changes in bourgeois literacy education, the rethinking of kinship, motherhood, nation, and state at the end of the 18th century. In his influential 1813 lecture on the different methods of translating, Schleiermacher describes the relationship of the writer to his mother tongue as something individual, specific to his language, innate, internal, and circumscribed by inheritance and nationality. He acknowledges the specific characteristic traits in this language and their creative use by the writer, and he argues for a translation that would retain the feeling of foreignness for the original language, something that we still draw on today, which is actually a strategy that is progressive and acknowledges difference and warns us of domestication. But the price for this progressive approach of foreignizing translation was paid by asserting at the same time that because of the individual and identical relationship between thought and expression in the mother tongue, a writer could never produce original literary work in another tongue, in a non-native tongue. Such multilingual practices were seen as ghost work or doppelgangertum. It is as if the celebration of enrichment of languages has a dead brother, a less pure, more boundary-crossing, multilingual twin. As if in the shadow of the Muttersprache there was another thing, dark, glowing, and squirming, a Mudsprache. For Schleiermacher, therefore, translation was a tool in the overarching project of educating and building a nation, which at this time didn't yet exist. This was a nation, the German one, driven by inner necessity towards translation because of its respect for things foreign, and whose greatest fortune would be its language, a kind of vast European archive where, quote, all the treasures of foreign art and scholarship would be united into a great historical whole, as it were, which would be kept safe in the center and heart of Europe, unquote. An archive enjoyable to everyone, they would simply have to learn German first to access it. While I smile like you do and also feel slightly uncomfortable with this nationalistic note, when I teach this text to my American translation students who are mostly monolingual, I kind of wish that their country had a little bit of this nationalistic translation chuspe and use the hegemonic market power of American publishing to use whatever English they have, world English or weird English, as an archive of thought, tolerance, and histories by simply translating more into it. A couple of weeks ago, I flew from New York to Innsbruck to attend a conference on transcultural poetry, which was really a wonderful utopian little gathering. I left my husband and my young daughter behind, and with them my roles as mother, wife, and teacher. I was going to be alone for a while, a woman, a poet, a translator. I had to switch planes in Berlin-Tegel, which is usually my home, although it is not the one I use for most of the year when I live and teach in New York. Into the gray morning, I stared at the town where I was born in 1979 and where I was invisibly translated in 1998 from an East German citizen into a Gesamtdeutsche or unified German citizen, and where I began to experience what I have slowly come to comprehend as an uncharted immigration or a silent deterritorialization on uncannily unmoving grounds. Most of this period after the fall of the wall is hidden in a kind of amnesiac childhood fog, which partly has to do with the silence around my father's employment in the East German Secret Service, which was wrapped up, cocooned, and then silenced for another 10 years. The few things that I do remember are, as I recently discovered, wrong or displaced or someone else's memories. I've come to understand that both my work as a poet of blurring boundaries between languages and my work as a translator, where I cross these boundaries to invite languages to lodge in other homes, is affected by my failing memory around the falling Moure, by these uncharted shifts that left me with my feet in the air and with a deep mistrust and resistance towards too closely knotted connections between language, nation, identity, and home. It's perhaps not by accident that I mostly love to translate other poets' work who is working multilingually or who come out of multilingual context. I'm not a refugee. I speak from a position of privilege that I am aware of. But I speak from a position of awareness and porousness towards other precarious positions. At Tegel, I stared at the TV screen in the corner of the kiosk where I had some currywurst. And unfortunately, I looked at the TV screen to see the self-proclaimed Donetsk leader Sakharchenko announce that there would be no more ceasefires. This was the morning after the attack on Mariupol. I was very tired suddenly. On the short flight to Innsbruck, I fell asleep immediately, a stone in the air. In the air, I dreamed I was on a plane with war refugees. Europe had erupted into a confusing and dirty civil war. There was no safe place for us to land anywhere on Earth. The pilot suddenly announced that we would have to land underground, where most Europeans had fled, hiding in tunnels and caves. There was a large opening or a gap in the ground into which our plane would have to maneuver and land. It was more likely that we would get stuck and explode. I woke up. At night, now sleepless and jet-lagged in the hotel I rode, the return to the mother tongue was an airplane filled with war refugees. A gaping hole in the ground, stuck. I did not write into the mother body of the earth. I did not write, I was a mother and now I return to my mother language where I am a child, in mud. It was madder than mud, transnational mud. Countries falling apart, hybrid wars, which already blurred the boundaries of nation states, muttering tongues. But what is wrong with translating into a mother tongue, into a nation? Shouldn't translators and readers be thankful for the nation because it provides us with a market, with a public, and if we're lucky, with translation funding, because someone in the cultural administration understands that language and culture benefit from things foreign? Yes and no. I think maybe in a Western European or perhaps only in a German context, the art of translation as developed from the influential Romantic perspective has been tied to the monolingual paradigm, or better yet to an institutionalized and internalized amnesia about multilingualism, precisely by the way in which the translation feeds the one and only mother tongue and changes and enriches it. Yet, what I want translation to do is to decenter the mother tongue and to decenter fictions of origins and belongings that are tied to it. I want to remind it of its mutterings on moorings. The work of translation, precisely because it is a dislocation, should resist national identities and instead be the dreamer, critical and creative recuperator of their alternative pasts, presents, and future. This is related, but somewhat different from Benjamin's idea of translation, tell us ultimately that all translations produce a pure language, or Ursprache, in which he saw the predestined, hitherto inaccessible realm of reconciliation and fulfillment of languages. But I think rather than Ursprache, what we need now is a Fürsprache, a speaking for. Translation as whispering through target language for and into other tangent languages and their speakers, who are highly mobile and often multilingual, either by force or by war or by economic pressure or by simple global mobility. Thus, translation as linguistic mammography can insist in creating a post-monolingual space rather than a space that is enriched of national literatures. It can create other languages and other homes, other systems of kin and kindness. Only when it charts what the maps conceal is a space created where readers, translators, and writers come to meet, to unfold, unfield in peaceful mud spaces beyond their mother tongues. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I would like to start by thanking Erín for a great opportunity to be here. I'm very honored and excited to be able to talk to you guys and share a little bit of my research. So I come from the city of Edmonton, where currently it's minus 15 Celsius. So today I found myself in this totally surreal place. We took a walk on the beach, so it was amazing. As Erín told you in her introduction, I just defended my doctoral dissertation at the University of Alberta. And I had a very strong impression that I need to sound really smart now. So when I saw the title of this roundtable translation as a resistant form, my initial temptation was to look at translation from a post-colonial perspective and consider its potentiality to resist and subvert dominant discourses. But then I started thinking about it. It's like, dude, what do you know about this? So I decided to change that subject a little bit and still stick to the topic of translation as a resistant form, but do something different. So what I would like to do today is I would like to make 4 preliminary theoretical remarks, and then I will try to make a logical transition to my own research and make sure that it's presented from the resistant perspective. And then hopefully Erín will pick it up somewhere and we will have a discussion. So I would like to talk about translation as an inherently resistant activity, an activity that is based on and predicated on resistance. So my first point is kind of obvious, but when people tell me that it's common knowledge, I always like to retort and ask them, have you written about it? So last year we had Lawrence Venuti visiting campus, and we've all, those of us who are interested in translation, are familiar with his work. And one of the statements that he made really captivated me because I never thought about it in that particular way. So he said translation is not only a decontextualizing activity, but also a recontextualizing activity. And normally we think about it from the linguistic and cultural perspective. So we take something from one language and move it to a different language, and from one culture to a different culture. But it's also other contexts like spatial, temporal, and socio-political. So that's one way in which context can create resistance. Number 2, we all like this great metaphor about translation as being a tool for bridging cultures and facilitating cross-cultural communication and mutual understanding. However, translation can also be conceived as an inherently aggressive act. And there are many theorists who approached it this way. For example, George Steiner, in his famous hermeneutic motion theory, suggested that translation is an act of aggression. This leads me to my third point regarding one of the basic dichotomies on which the entire enterprise of translation studies is premised, which is to domesticate versus foreignize. And on the one hand, translation is an essentially domesticating activity, but on the other hand, we assimilate the other, which causes resistance. So to what extent do we want this otherness to be visible in the translated text? And finally, again, on a more obvious level, resistance in translation is probably epitomized in the concept of untranslatability, which has numerous examples such as poetry, or one of the concepts that I picked from Erín, and I'm very grateful to her, the concept of the soundscape. How do you render this? I keep quoting Robert Frost, or rather his definition of poetry is something that is lost in translation. Unfortunately, I've never been able to verify that quotation, but it's commonly attributed to Robert Frost, so if somebody can give me a clue there, that would be great. Or other instances of untranslatability, such as puns, wordplay, or humor, or proper names, or cultural notions, or nonsense. But the example of untranslatability that I'm interested in and that I've been researching over the last couple of years is the concept of transmises. Now, I always like to preface my spiel on transmises by telling a story. A couple of years ago, I presented this concept at ACES, which is a Slavic conference in Los Angeles. And one of my reviewers, Michael Katz, from Middlebury College, if I'm not mistaken, a very famous translator, he translated Dostoevsky's notes from the Underground. So he actually interrupted me, and he said, "Trans what?" So right at that time, I realized that definitions are going to be really important in my life. So transmises is a term that was coined by my former professor from Penn State, Dr. Thomas Beebe, and it's a metaphorical conjunction of translation and mimesis. So in simple language, however, transmises stands for a representation of translation, both as a process and as a product, in a work of fiction, or of the portrayal of the figure of the translator in a work of fiction. So transmises is probably found its most intellectually thought-provoking articulation in the works of Jorge Luis Borges. So his widely anthologized short stories, Pierre Menard, translator of the Quixote, in which Pierre Menard is trying to reproduce Cervantes' masterpiece word for word, or his Library of Babel, which contains books, all books, translated into all languages. But there are many other examples, and again, during our discussion period, I hope that you can probably give me some more suggestions about transmetic words. So other examples, for example, include a movie by Sidney Pollack, The Interpreter, with Nicole Kidman, or another example that I like to give in Canada, a country in which I've spent 7 years now, and unfortunately, which I'm ashamed of, I still don't speak a word of French. So another great example of a transmetic word, or at least a transmetic title, would be the play by Jean-Claude Germain, a Canadian play with the French subtitle, Une plaie canadienne. And people like myself think that that's the French translation of the title. So in my dissertation, I look at transmises from two perspectives. So I argue that transmises can be viewed from the theoretical and the practical perspective. So from the theoretical perspective, transmises can do at least four things, in my opinion. So first of all, it has the potential of dispelling a common stereotype and misconception of translation as an inherently fallible act. In other words, in most of our discussions of translation, we approach it as something that leads to loss, but very rarely do we consider it as something that's about gain, and that's exactly what it is. It's about gain. Number two, I argue that transmesis helps us to deconstruct the binary discourse of translation studies, or the discourse of translation studies that is predicated on binaries or binary oppositions. So, for example, the original is something new, and the translation is something derivative or something secondary. The original author as the creator, and the translator as the subservient, not the subversive. And I'm referring to Susan Jill Levine, the subversive scribe, and other binaries like that. Finally, or thirdly, transmesis allows us to question a problematic concept of equivalence that unfortunately still dominates many discussions about translation studies. And finally, from the theoretical perspective, transmesis helps us to raise other philosophical questions about translation, such as translation and intertextuality, or translation and adaptation, translation and imitation, and so on and so forth. Now, from a practical perspective, transmesis poses a very formidable challenge to the actual translator, because it's one of the instances of untranslatability. So the translators, unfortunately, are left with very few options. So in the texts that I consider, and the three texts that I look at in my dissertation are the Russian novel by Viktor Pelevin, Generation P, translated by Andrew Bromfield as Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens is a pun on the title, so not Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens is somebody who switched through the television channels because television controls reality, and post-Soviet Russians are being brainwashed by the people who control television. And again, like today, the similarities with what's happening in real life are just uncanny to me. The second option that the translator has are footnotes. In other words, Pelevin's original text in Russian is intrinsically bilingual. In other words, in his Russian text, he uses both English and Russian. So then when this text is translated into English, the translator has not very many options. In fact, he has to resort to footnotes to say, okay, this was in English in the original, which to the English reader, it's an educational experience, but it's not a very aesthetic experience. And finally, this is something that kind of leads me to my argument, is creativity. So one of the things that I'm trying to argue in my thesis is that translation should be primarily conceived of as a creative, transformative act, and essentially intertextual act, rather than a reproductive act based on the transfer of meaning. I think my time is up. I could probably continue talking about this, but hopefully if you have some questions, I will address them in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I need my visual aid.
Get out of your way. Let you stand up.
I think I can just bring it over here.
You can stand there.
Okay.
You want to go see? Yeah, okay. Me too. Here we are. You have the floor.
I want to stay there by myself.
I'm just looking for presentation mode, but slideshow. Presenter view. Okay. No. Can you hear me? Am I okay? Okay. Thank you very much, Erín, for inviting me, and thank you to the audience, and thank you to my friends for showing up. I feel very lucky. And yes, I'm the wild card tonight. And I'm just going to flip through, what's the date up there? 1988. It's got to be 25 years, 26, 27 years. But anyway, this is just to say that I've been working across painting and text for many years, and in slightly different ways. And I'm just going to grab my notes to remind myself what I wanted to say about these. with this early work, I wanted to draw critical attention to the modernist paradigm as it was what I felt was emblematically represented in abstract painting, and to disrupt this through various strategies. And this is from 1989, The Story. So these artworks were paintings with texts and also accompanied with chapbooks. So each of these paintings had a story related to it, and there were 10 of these. And this is an example of a diagram and the story attached. So that's an early work. If you want to investigate any of this work on your own, there's a good repository at SFU Library Summit where it has a full collection of most of my text work. And the other thing about, I also work with photograph and painting, so I use text against photography instead of as a caption to underscore the relationality of a normally documentary medium. At a certain point, people started telling me they were tired of reading art. So I thought I'd try a few different new things. And I'm just going to flip through this. I made a lot of work about books being abused and leaving my library dramatically. And also, I did them in the air, I did them underwater. I was doing some on fire, but then I just didn't get any good images going. This is Michael Turner's Pornographer's Poem. So, and then in terms of how I like to use the text, I like the small painting format, and I like the small text format, and I think it's because many years ago, when I was a teenager, I came across this book. And I since learned that this poet, I don't know how you pronounce his name, I've never heard anybody say that, Archilokos. His work only exists in fragments, and apparently he was a poet from 480 BC, but one of the first, or maybe the first poet who wrote about emotions. So this is probably why it appealed to me as a teenager. And this is an image of, I love how these are laid out all over the page, and how these brackets have things missing and things in them. This was a very, very appealing to me from early on. Also, when I was in, I went to, I went to University of Manchester to study town and country planning for a short while, and I had been living in Rome. I ended up going to this poetry reading by W.H. Auden, and this book, this was 1971, so the book had just come out. And I saw this, he read this, and then I saw it in the book. It's the Hilton in Rome, where I lived in Rome for 13 years. And I memorized this poem, and I just think it's the only poem I know by heart. So I don't have far to go when I get Alzheimer's. Another major influence for me is Lawrence Weiner. So after Italy, I went to art school in Halifax and met Lawrence Weiner, became familiar with his work, and I think it's probably somebody who's very close to me, or at least I think about him all the time, and I really like his work a lot. So the text on the left says, 1 quart exterior green industrial enamel thrown on a brick wall. I don't know if you know Lawrence Weiner's work, but these were artworks that you would purchase, and you could perform them if you wanted to. And then the later work is just as it is, it's text on walls or text wherever they go. So they're kind of texts that exist as images. Okay, now we're to the present and my recent work, which was inspired by me having to come up with, well, there were two things. I wanted to go back to painting because it was anyway, for various reasons. And then I was also teaching a painting class again at SFU, and I thought, okay, I want to teach these kids abstraction. How should I do this? And I came across this book, and there were all these pictures of Canadian abstract paintings, and so I wrote descriptions of them. I wrote 20 different descriptions, and then I handed them out at random, and then they made an abstract painting each. So just a small example of what a description might look like. And I tried to make them really straightforward so you wouldn't get too confused by copying them, but then if you just have like a short amount of... I didn't really want to make them like an essay. So nobody managed to come up with the actual Angela Leach look on the left. So, and then I was really fascinated with how, I've always been fascinated with how abstract painting is written about. And so this is a page from that book this is a book by Roald Nasgard, who's an art historian who writes a lot about Canadian art, particularly painting. And I just want to get my place here. So it's hard if you're going to write about painting historically, and some you get tied up with having to deal with, how to describe what the painting is, and so you end up having to be really descriptive about things, but then it's really kind of abstract how you describe what's going on, especially in an abstract painting. So I don't have the actual text here in front of me. So deep eruptive textures were created by dragging saw blades across the surface. Paint was pulled into ridges and smudged into crevices. So this very dramatic idea of painting, of course, just kind of fulfills the idea of the romantic artist struggling away, and it's a very masculine romantic modernism that is prevailing here. And I'm interested in this. Somehow it's caught my attention, so I want to do something with that, and I wanted to turn it into my own experience in the studio, which is quite drab really. So I use these images or these texts as sources for descriptions of my own process as a painter. And so the gawky matte slab, luminescent nickel, yellow, lemon. It's just the colors that come to mind when you have to make decisions about color. So lists and recipes are evocative to me, and also because of what is left out, what is implied. I really am attracted to that kind of descriptive language, and I'm also in love with the materiality of painting. So for me, I just can't do painting without there having to be some kind of meta commentary on it from my point of view, because I really... it's important for me to announce myself as the interrupter, interloper in the kind of masculine romantic painting tradition. But since I was invited to be on this panel, now I can think of these as translations. And to think how painting is translated into text for readers who want to read about painting history, and how Roald Nasgard it was interesting that he introduces this history of Canadian abstraction, but is pulling us along with this really evocative, descriptive text. I'm making paintings out of words that are about painting, and also words that are about how painting is kind of drab, an activity that can be drab, and an activity that is about organizing chaos. And then this is the point where I was thinking, okay, I'm going to leave off here, and you guys can tell me what kind of translation activity this is. Since we're going to have a discussion afterwards, you never know. So I thought, okay, well, here I'm just going to show these. And these were completed for an exhibition in Toronto for last year. And to date, I haven't come up with any works that I really want to show anybody yet after these series. But the reason the texts are in these constricting blocks of text, constricting blocks of form, have to do with issues of composition, and that somehow I want to conjure up composition as a factor in modernist painting, as a constricting form, but also these texts make their shapes. Squill blue, I was really disappointed to know that squill is actually a fish, and it's not a kind of blue. And I've just made it into a kind of blue, but... And this is a list of color: ochre, chrome, ochre, ultramarine, all patchy. So it's just a list of things that one does on paintings. What a furor, what passion in these irregular lines. Ice slick green slapped over and over hot magenta, so flat. I decided that these didn't have to be readable when you're standing straight in front of them, so because they're not books. But as lead white cut here and here, fast with azure. Drip ripped, ground slapped pink, and Broadway lavender. Broad-wide lavender. I want to read that as Broadway. Yeah.
I think you should say, Alison, that this work was published in the Flatland Review's translation issue.
Yes, okay, yes. I did, I should know that, shouldn't I? I should have been aware of that. I think this might be the last. Oh no, this is a work that wasn't actually exhibited, so it was kind of done after that. So this was actually based on a note that I found in the street where somebody was listing their clothing in colors. So it's a chartreuse socks and a something lavender blouse and some different color boots. So slap chartreuse, and where does it go from there? Yes. Tinged with, yes. Thank you. So I love the materiality of paint, but I really want it to be, I just can't do it all the way. I have to be critical of it while engaging in, trying to make paintings that are loving paintings. Okay. That's over and out for me.
So thank you, everybody. I think, thanks, Nicole, for bringing back the light. Maybe a bit more. Is there some more? Okay, thanks. So thank you very much. I think that we ended up with a very felicitous kind of flow between Uljana talking about translations detect deformations that move through texts, right to the creative transformations that are necessary to translate instances of translation in fiction in one language into representations of translation in fiction in another language, and through the representations of translation, in a sense, through describing paintings that aren't there, that there's another, but that make another painting, so that there's kind of a lot of layers there for consideration of translation. As we said, as Jenny pointed out that Alyson's work, as well as having, before it appeared in the Capilano Review, it's been an inspiration for various poets for helping us to look at language differently. But as well, her visual work gets published in places like the Capilano Review, where it's seen and read alongside more normative literary work, stuff that's written where the words are trying to say what the words are trying to say, instead of the words are trying to say what the painting is doing without showing you. Anyways, it's wonderful. So thank you to all three of you, and thank you, you attentive listeners. And we're willing to entertain questions or comments if anybody would like to contribute.